All right, cool. So, Eric, welcome to the Nidus Anarchy series. Thanks for coming on. This is pretty awesome. I know we've chatted a bit in the past. Thanks for being one of the pioneers in our interview here for the Nidus
Yeah,
Anarchy series. This is really what I want to be doing. It's like I know I'm not the most entertaining person in the world, and I don't have all the answers by far. So I'm trying to reach out to experts in the field that have been doing this way longer than me and that know a lot more than me, because that's how we all learn and grow. And I'm being completely selfish. I'm trying to interview the smartest people out there so that I can learn and grow myself. So that's why I wanted to have you on board.
awesome.
So Eric Leach, thank you for coming on to the show.
Yeah,
Really appreciate it.
yeah,
Um, yeah, go ahead.
yeah. Thanks, Adam. I'm going to dispute that you don't know it. I, I, I think, I think you should count yourself amongst the industry Illuminati. I think you've definitely been there, done that, seen it. Oh no. um, but yeah, thanks for having me on. I love what you're doing, and I'm really I'm really behind the idea of educating and sharing knowledge and doing that. It's what I try and do with my newsletter and things like that. Because I think we need help. We need to get better at writing software and building identity infrastructures and
Yeah.
creating what's actually helpful for our customers. So
And
I love what you're doing. Glad to
and
be a
you've been in
part of
that
it.
space particularly for a very long time with the creating of the identity
Very,
management software. And I think it's great to see.
yeah,
Right now is I think we're finally on the precipice of when identity management software is finally how I think it should have been like 20 years ago. Like it's finally everyone's kind of
right,
figured it out and it got into the enterprise to where it's manageable. There's individual pieces that we're farming it out and making calls to external services. We don't have to house everything internally and centralize everything. So
yeah,
let's talk about your background, right? Because I mean, you've
yeah,
been with every major companies. I mean, Sun and Oracle and Strata. I mean, you've been up through the ranks by far. So why don't you give me a rundown on kind
yeah,
of your background, your history, and where you've been?
yeah. I started as an accidental product manager a long time ago, and I worked for, some people will remember this from the notorious .com boom and bust, but I worked for a company called Critical Path. Critical Path had bought PureLogic and Isocore. Both of them had directories and meta directories. And I started out as a product manager working on meta directory,
Hmm.
which was kind of at the very beginning of the identity, people recognizing the identity problem. Like, hey, we've got, people in our workforce and we have to do something about this. So I had been playing around with a tool for another little startup, and somebody heard about that. It was like, hey, we hear you know LDAP. Yeah. Congratulations, you're the product manager. It's like, oh, what does that mean? I had no idea. Um, but that kind of, I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed the problem that we were trying to solve, which was helping, especially big enterprises, to get a better handle on how they were managing their workforce and their
Yeah.
users, partners, contractors, and all that stuff. And so that's where it started. And then it sort of evolved, as the market evolved, as the industry evolved, and people started. I remember when we first, so I moved to Sun after that, and we first started talking about single sign-on, and you would go in and talk to a customer. It was one of those, like, lighthouse moments. And that's an inside joke, which I'll
Yeah.
explain in a minute, right? But it was one of those lighthouse moments where you would go in and you would talk to a customer and you would say, "Hey, how many times did you sign in today?" And they would, "I have no idea, like dozens,
Yeah.
hundreds, like everything that I touch, I have to log into." And you would say to them, "Well, what if you could only log in once?" And they were like, "Oh my God, can you really do that?" Yeah, mostly, but yeah, okay. And it was like one of those moments that everybody talks about in, building companies and
Yeah.
building
And this is
software and everything, where,
pre-federation. Like that wasn't even a
and
thing back then.
pre-federation, yeah, like we haven't even figured out that part yet. It was just like, hey, inside your company, I can help you sign into stuff. And it was amazing to people that we could do that. And I think it also started the thing that you mentioned, which was, how do we get identity to behave the way that we really wanted it to, because
Yeah.
we sort of developed this part of the identity infrastructure kind of on its own in isolation. We said, oh, we have directories and we can put users in there, and let's build this SSO thing on top of the directories. And integrity was obviously at the forefront of doing that.
Yeah.
But we did a pretty good job of it at Sun as well, and built OpenSSO. Right? And so OpenSSO became kind of that first open source enterprise product at a time when people weren't doing that. Right now, everybody's like open source, sure. At the time, people were like open source, no.
Yeah, no way. That's a
You know,
bad word.
they were like, no way. Yeah, exactly. And so while that was happening, this SSO thing is happening. People start developing on top of those directories, like, hey, what if we could get people into HR and email and the network, and get them to log in from their workstations and do all that stuff. And that's sort of how provisioning and was born. Not even governance yet, right? That hasn't even happened yet. But just like, how do we move the identity stuff around? And then regulation happens. SOX, Sarbanes-Oxley happens,
That was
and
the
all of a
big
sudden,
boom.
it was the big boom, and all of a sudden, provisioning tools become like governance tools, and like they're used by a completely different group of people inside the enterprise. And that was how it exploded, really. And so you have this like massive explosion of SSO on one side and this massive explosion on provisioning and governance on the other side. And they happened almost kind of independently, right?
Yeah.
My friend Topher Marie, who's the CTO of Strata, likes to say that, identity systems weren't architected. Nobody architected them to be like this. Nobody set out and said, this is the way it should, right? They accreted over time.
And acquired.
And acquired, and like this stuff came in, and now and now we have this new business unit, and they've got to do something. And so they accreted over time. Nobody like deliberately started out to do this. And as a result, they suffer from what he calls the Anna Karenina problem, which is all identity systems are miserable in their own way.
Oh, you've worked at, okay. I don't want to name names right now, but that's so perfect that I could have lived that. I would have tattooed that on my chest for about a good 10 years.
Right. And we've all seen that, right? If you've been playing in this space and helping people to like set this up and build it, it really is. It's like, are you sure you want to do that?
like get ready. This is gonna suck.
Oh no, no!
I got the extra giant size of lube. We're gonna be good.
This is not gonna be what you think it's gonna be. And so, I moved to Oracle. We built very similar technologies. Eventually, we swallowed.
Did you move to Oracle when Oracle acquired Sun, or was it independent of that? Prior? Okay.
Yeah, it was prior. Yeah.
You saw it coming and just jumped over?
Well, it was pretty obvious that Sun was going to struggle significantly. And being in a software business and a hardware company is really hard.
Especially when they're all about open source, everything.
Yeah, what's interesting is the open source legacy of Sun, and how so many things are still there out in the world because of Sun. OpenSSO and OpenAM and ForgeRock and OpenDS being obvious examples of that. But lots of other things, the Java stack and Open Solaris and like all of these other things that.
Well, that's how the internet started, right? Like back in like the late 90s, that was the mentality, especially like hackers back then. It was all about just creating and sharing and building and like basically we want everyone to become smarter. We all want to build the best software possible. And the only way to do that is if we all share and communicate together. And then once everyone figured out, I think Larry Ellison was probably one of the first guys to be like, wait a minute, I'm going to make this myself and I'm going to make $1 bajillion because I want to own an island. And he nailed it. And then everyone else was like, holy shit, that's a crazy business model. And then they just went forward.
And you look at kind of how that played out, right? And it was the first of those, Oracle's trying to buy Java, right? And MySQL, right? Because those are the two biggest existential threats to their business model at the time. And in the process of doing that, they got all this overlapping technology, right? And
Yeah.
there was no way we were going to keep all of that stuff, right? I think Ping and ForgeRock are in the exact same
Oh,
position
we're
right
about to
now,
watch that
right?
all over again.
Yeah, which I wrote an article about that got a lot of strong reaction, I would say. But the reality was, we're looking at these like 100% overlapping stacks, right?
So do you know why
And
Oracle went with OUD over ODSE? Like what was how that happened?
that was the one where it was actually both for a while, for a
Yeah. Yeah,
significant amount of
ODSE
time. It
stayed in
was,
for a while. Yeah.
yeah, it was the only real place where um, both of the technologies lived on for a while.
Yeah.
Waveset Lighthouse, so going back
Yeah.
to my, which Sun had acquired,
Yep.
that was gone, right? And far
Yeah.
superior product, but gone, right? It just,
That blew my mind. Like I thought they were going to be like, okay,
yeah,
we're going to keep, Oracle Access Manager, but OIM, we're going to, shovel that out, and we're just going to bring Sun, because like when I was at Microsoft working with Sam ran the Sun practice and I ran the Oracle practice, and we basically, I mean, it was all friendly, but like we're butting heads, like we'd have to argue which one was better. It was so
yeah,
hard for me to make the point why Oracle was better all the time.
yeah.
but it, but they
It's
wound up. Do you know
it's
why they sunset the Sun product? Like what was the inside there?
Yeah, so the thing that we were challenged with as, kind of the product teams inside of Oracle as this was coming in. I mean, we didn't ask for any of this, right?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah,
this wasn't like, oh gee, you know what I'd really like to do. We were like halfway or a little bit more of the way through building all of this middleware infrastructure
Mhm.
for Fusion middleware and all the Fusion apps
Yeah,
stuff, right? And so it was okay, start over with that, right?
yeah.
There's a train leaving the station, months ahead of us, right? And start over with that and hope that we make the train, or be the people that are like, we're going to stop the train entirely.
Yeah.
Right. And nobody wanted to be that, right? And we were, the products that we were building, were decent. They were good. They had, strengths. Whether OAM was truly better than OpenSSO is kind of a debate. The
Yeah.
architectures had kind of like settled into some patterns by that time.
Yeah.
Federation had come in, obviously, and we had some pretty good tools, right, to
So
make that work.
Oracle scrapped they kept OIM scrap Sun. So for the Ping ForgeRock thing, do you think they're going to scrap one of the IDM tools, or do you think they'll be like ForgeRock is for SIAM and maybe Ping will be for workforce? Do you think they might go down that path?
I mean, they could, right? They could kind of try out and do the Okta Auth0 thing, right? Because
Yeah.
Okta Auth0 had to do that, right?
Yeah.
But I always think of it in terms of the customer, right? The customer picked Auth0 over Okta, most likely, right?
Yeah.
Because it did the thing that do they want to switch? No,
Yeah.
right? The customer picked ForgeRock probably over Ping and some
Yep.
other things because it solved their problem. Do they want to switch? No, right?
Yeah.
And so I maybe they can try and keep both, but I mean, there's
Yeah.
so much overlap between those two
Oh
things
yeah.
that it's really hard to imagine. And it's again, right? They're sitting there, and I think Peter Barker is now taking over product for the whole thing. And his job now is looking at this like one for one overlap on his stacks. What do I
Yeah.
do?
Well, and SailPoint is
And
now like technically still under Tama Bravo. So they're not part of Ping,
yeah,
but like that's got to be in his mind.
yeah. So what do they do with that, right? And I don't know that's super clear.
Yeah.
Um, but I think based on my experience, you're going to have to disappoint some customers, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Eventually.
After the Sun and Oracle acquisition, I've been racking my brain trying to remember the code name of this project, and I can't. But basically, we all got assigned like, here's the top 100 customers globally. You
Yeah.
have to go out as PMs. We all had to go out and take some number of those and sit down with them and say, the product that you bought, that you spent millions of dollars on licenses and
And
more millions of
implementation.
dollars
Yeah.
to implement,
Yeah.
right? Like, and that's really the scary part, right?
Yeah.
7-to-1 spend has been kind of the standard the whole time, right? Services to license. And you had to tell them this thing is going away, right? And it was those big implementation dollars that they were going to have to respend, and
Yeah.
nobody was
And
happy about that.
like a
Nobody,
year plus in
right?
time, easily.
Yeah, and so I mean, the systems integrators loved it, right? Because it was
Hey.
like, yay, right? We're going to go back
That's how
and
I
make
made
this
a
money
living,
again,
was that
right?
pain.
Exactly. And you know, so I think the thing that the people that are making the decisions about the acquisitions and the combinations of these things don't have insight into, clearly don't have insight into,
Yeah.
is that impact, right? They don't understand the businesses well enough to say, you know, oh, if we combine these two companies, this is going to have this impact on these customers.
Mhm.
And you know, I think they understand it at a like theoretical, you know,
Yeah.
philosophical, metaphysical level.
But
I don't
having
know.
to talk to them face to face, I think, is a very different
Right, but
ballgame.
sitting in the room with the, you know, the man or the woman who's responsible for like, okay, you want me to do what? Like
Yeah.
those are really different, very, very hard conversations.
Yeah. They
And
get
it was
angry very
straining
fast.
on everybody. Yeah, I mean, well, and you don't blame them for being angry,
No,
right?
I
Like
would
if
be
you were
too.
sitting in their
Exactly.
chair, you'd be pissed, right? And
Yeah.
so you're not going like you're being irrational. It's like, yeah, no, I'm ruining your day, and I
Yep.
get it, you know.
So
Um,
like you mentioned the 7-to-1 spend. So that was definitely
yeah,
like the case. It was just, you'd be spending so much more time and money on implementation of these products because they're just such beasts, and they connected and they touched everything, and you had to interact with
yeah,
everything that was out there. Nowadays, though,
yeah,
do you still see it the same way? Because I don't think we're in the same, I don't think we're in that same type of market for today's software.
yeah. So things. Well, so part of this comes back to the architecture, right? And I
Mhm.
think what we're doing with the software is we're trying to model human behavior, which is
Yeah.
super hard with
Yeah.
software, right? We're
Yeah.
modeling human behavior with software.
Yeah.
It's
All
super
out of the
hard.
box.
Yeah, and it's not all out of the box. It's you have to heavily customize it because people behave unexpectedly, right?
Yeah.
Um, every customer I ever talked to told me, "Oh, what we're doing is totally unique," and they
Yeah.
were partly right and partly wrong. Right? It was like you're not that unique, but
Yeah.
yeah, this one thing, this one tiny little thing that you're asking for is just you. It's just you guys, right? Um, but then I think you know, cloud changed a lot, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so you got lots and lots of cloud services and SaaS coming in. And actually, this was the time that I moved from Oracle to Salesforce, right?
Okay.
And started seeing this from the SaaS side of things. Um, and you're right, it doesn't have that same like ratio dollar impact when you're using SAML or OAuth or OIDC to connect an identity provider to a
Yeah.
SaaS app that supports that stuff.
Standards have
It's not,
helped a lot.
yeah, standards helped a lot with that. But then when you got, right, is you got all this on-prem stuff and
Yeah.
then all of this cloud stuff, and they were not integrated. They're not connected. At best, you got some superficial federation between
Hmm.
the two at best. And most people didn't even get that. And so what you have now is you have, you know, companies that are running probably at least 4 or 5 different IDPs, right?
Yeah.
On average,
Easily.
I would say. And everybody, you know, and some companies, I won't name them, but I know there's a friend of mine who I became friends because we were helping them with their implementation, and they sell network hardware. And you know, they bought everything and they implemented everything, and you know, so I think what happened is, you know, people ended up with these like crazy divergent sets of things that they couldn't bring together. They bought Okta and they had Microsoft, and you know, some people ended up playing, not as many, but playing around with Google.
Hmm.
Google's identity infrastructure, their identity providers are a mess, right? It's
Yeah.
like
I don't know how they even released it that way, honestly. Like, if someone
I
even asked me,
mean,
it's like,
yeah,
oh, so what about Google? I'd be like, what about it?
what about it? Yeah, exactly. You know, um, Amazon comes into play and they build identity very, very specifically for the platform, right?
Yep.
They don't build it as like, I'm going to run things on this platform. The identity was never for that. Cognito kind of, but
Oh yeah,
and there's
we have a.
smart people working on Cognito now, but like it's never been that thing, right?
It's a small piece. Like people are like, oh look, we have Federation of Clouds. Like it's a very tiny thing, heavily wedged into a specific use case. If you can fit
Yeah.
that, cool. But
Great,
most people
but
can't fit that.
most people can't do that, right? And so you got Microsoft, you've got Amazon, you've got Google, you've got Okta, you've got Ping, you've got Savient or SailPoint, you've
Yep.
got next thing it's like it just keeps growing and growing and growing and growing. And I think that's why we're seeing the identity security market come about the way that it has, where people are now looking at the identity infrastructure as these points of vulnerability.
Mhm.
And they're not wrong, right? I think when you have that
Oh, I
many things
think
to
they
manage,
absolutely
like
are. You have one place with all the passwords for everyone stored.
that's
That's a risk.
yeah, yeah. And I think the reality that people don't realize too much, especially about like Okta, for example, like for the longest time, like almost 90% of their integrations were based on scraping login pages and form stuffing, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that was how they built that business, right? And I've had Okta people get really mad at me when I say that, but it's true, right?
I
It's
think
like
I've had
that's what
every
you
vendor
did,
get upset at
right?
me. It's like I
Right?
always side on the customer. It's like what's best for them. I'm going to tell them the truth, and the vendor may not be the happiest, but hey, that's the way it
Yeah.
is.
And so there was a period of time where these new identity cloud services are really just big password vaults, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and that is scary, right? And hackers figured that out, and they've been going after them, tooth and nail ever since, right?
Yep.
Successfully, tooth and nail ever since. So, um, so I think we got this like bifurcation and that proliferated identity services, and now people are starting to look at, okay, we need to do better at monitoring and managing and being able to identify what's going on in our cloud infrastructure.
Mhm.
And kind of the centerpiece of that is identity. And so that's where you get all these like new market categories. And I think it's way too finely segmented. I don't really think long term there's a huge difference between, cloud identity and entitlements management and, ITDR and
Well,
identity threat
my
detection and response,
this
right? It's like
I deal with this all the time right now. Is everyone's like, oh, so do you know SIAM? It's like, do I know customer? Yes. Well, it's different than
yes,
workforce. It's like, oh,
yeah,
the use cases are and how you set it up it is, but it's the same software. It's the same ideology
yeah,
under the hood. So like I think what it is like what you're saying, that everyone's kind of branching out is everyone wants to be the big dog in this new field. So like, oh well, we are the best for a SaaS risk identity based compliance software suite. Okay.
yeah. Okay,
Congratulations.
what does that mean, right? Like how did like with dozens and dozens of vendors spread across more than a dozen market categories now, like how would any customer make sense of this? Should I buy
Yeah.
Orca, or should I buy this little like independent
Yeah.
specialty CIEM vendor, right, or ITDR vendor? Like and how would a customer know? How would a customer figure that out, right?
So
And
one
I
area that
think that's the big issue right now with the
so
market.
one area is orchestration. I think that's an actual new segment that actually does garner it being its own segment in the identity space. You're obviously very familiar with the orchestration. So, what's your
Yeah.
definition of identity orchestration?
So I think orchestration is important because you need to find a way to get all of the identity systems to actually be aware of one another. Right? So that is not always the case. Like I said, when I called it superficial federation, it's like, oh, I know
Yeah,
I have this thing on the other side, right? Um, but even with SAML, you would pass an assertion to, an SP, and what it did with that, you had no idea, right?
yeah,
Um, And when it would send you some authentication, it could say, yeah, I authenticated him. I did a good job of it. And you're like, just had to trust that, right? But you don't actually know what's on the other side. And so I think what orchestration is useful for is being able to see across identity providers what's actually there. Now, I think, when you look at the identity, the entitlements management tools that are out there now, and the ITDR tools that are out there now, what they're doing is introspecting into the identity systems to see, like, what have you actually configured here, right?
Mhm.
What is actually set up? What do the policies look like? How do they work? What are they protecting? And I think that's really important, because here's maybe this is not a dirty secret, but I'll call it that, is the people that are running the apps have no idea how the identity systems work
No,
at all.
but they
They just
shouldn't.
know that they need to integrate.
Yeah.
Right. And so that in and of itself, not a big deal, right? But the identity teams also have no idea how the apps work and how they're
Right.
consuming their identity, right? And so there's no place where those things, do a good job of overlapping. So nobody knows what's going on, right?
Yeah.
And so I think where, and if you do that across 5 or 6 or 7 different things, like, you got a real problem, right?
Yeah.
You do not have the kind of visibility that you need. And if you don't have visibility, you can't protect it. And so I think orchestration and these threat detection and response tools and that kind of stuff do a much better job of giving people visibility into what their identity infrastructure is actually doing.
Mhm.
And I think that's going to be critical to people having getting to a coherent architecture as they go forward. Because I think it can get better, right? I think the infrastructure can improve, and I think
So
people know how to do it now.
you're a co-founder of Strata, right? So how did that start? What was the whole aha moment of, hey, you know what? Let's do this. Like, how did that kind of happen?
Yeah, I think when we set out to do that, the idea was, look, everybody's going to be multi-cloud, and we were inside Oracle, and Larry Ellison had been saying cloud's not a thing for, I don't know, 5 or 10 years, right? And all of a sudden he realized, oh shit, it's a thing. I better do something about this. And he believed that it was Oracle for Oracle. Like, he's like, we're going to just rule this. Nobody, Microsoft will go away. Amazon will. Everybody will just use Oracle because they use our database, so therefore they'll use our cloud.
Yeah.
It's a silly thesis, right? It's like, and so I think the reality of multi-cloud and the reality of multi-cloud identity, like each of those platforms having its own identity infrastructure, and then all of the other independent identity infrastructure that was out there, was like, oh, there's a real problem here, right?
Mhm.
There's an issue with making all of these things work together coherently. And so I think, that was kind of the underlying thesis for it, is, how do we as an industry help customers get better at
Mhm.
managing this stuff and give them visibility to things and help them understand what they're running, right? I don't, you might have this experience, but when you go and talk to somebody and say, well, how many apps do you have connected to this thing? And
Oh
they
my
go,
God.
100, right?
Yeah.
And then you go and you, like, actually do the analysis, like, you have more than 1,000 apps. And
Yeah.
they're like, really?
It's been in
They're
here
like,
for 8
yeah,
years. Yeah. You've just been
yeah.
constantly throwing apps
um,
at it.
yeah. Do you have any idea how many people are accessing that app?
Yeah.
Right.
And now
And
SiteMiner's
so
gone.
this,
What are you going to do?
yeah, now what are you going to do? Right. And, and then I think people started thinking about zero trust, right? And, like, how do they do a zero trust architecture? And you can't do it without good identity infrastructure. Like, you just can't. Um, if you don't know who's logging into stuff, right?
Mhm.
And you're trying to do, and you can't trust, you can't verify, you can't identify, you can't remediate, you can't do any of that stuff. So you can't do zero trust, real zero trust. I mean, like, the architectural pattern, not the buzzword, but treating everything as if it's happening on a public network.
Yeah.
inside your enterprise, you can't do that, right? Because you have no idea who's accessing what and when and how they're using it, and whether it's legitimate or not. And so I think that's where the real challenge for these customers come in now, is trying to figure that out as they're trying to make their enterprise architectures more resilient against threats.
So one of the big
Which,
things
as an industry, we're failing at that, right?
oh yeah, yeah, well, absolutely.
It's getting worse, right?
And
The security
this
problem
is
is
kind of like,
getting
so
worse.
in the identity space, like we were saying before, all the identities are centralized stored. They're stored in a central repo of some kind, a central identity management
Yeah,
software that's kind of the brain, and it's the
yeah,
hub to all the spokes to everything else that goes out there. And
yeah.
there's have you ever played around with zero knowledge proofs with regards to for like authentication at all? Because I'm a big proponent of decentralized identity, right? Like I think we're going to be moving towards self-sovereign. It remediates so much risk. Implementation time drastically goes down. People are a lot happier that way in the long run. But
Yeah.
what I'm wondering is if we can integrate more zero knowledge proof type of infrastructure into the identity space, so we're not actually sharing PII, we're not sharing any type of infrastructure, or any type of anything that could lead an attacker to be able to garner more information about whatever the victim is, or their attack vector they're trying to go for.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, right? Because it as a technology, it represents a good solution, right?
Yeah,
But I don't think that technology is what gets in the way. I think most enterprises look at security as a risk management thing. They don't actually care about the security part. They just want to know about the risk, right?
liability.
I
Yeah,
had, yeah, so exactly, right. So the liability thing, who's going to assume the liability for that when there's a breach? And you're going back to your cyber insurance provider who's trying to jack your premiums by 1,000% or whatever it is, because you got breached. Who's taking the liability for that? And you say, well, I had this identity infrastructure. Like, okay, today, who would take the liability for it, but you don't know who would take the liability for it in that case. And so I think until that gets worked out, um, I think it's going to be hard for people to assume the risk of it,
yeah,
even if there were architectural benefits to doing it.
yeah. And it's interesting you say that about the risk, because I'm seeing a lot in clients now where they're moving to the cloud, right? They're going, what, we're going to use
Yeah.
ForgeRock Cloud, or we're going to use Ping One or whatever. And it's like,
Yeah.
okay, cool. Well, how are you maintaining a backup of that data locally? Like if they disappear tomorrow, how are you ensuring you have everything? And they're like, oh, we're not. It's like, why would you not do that? And like, oh, well,
Yeah.
because they said they'll always be up, and that's their problem. I'm like, but it's your business. What are you doing?
Right.
And they don't
Yeah.
care. They're like, no, that's their problem, because if something happens, it's their fault, their responsibility. We're in the clear. It's like, you are from a liability risk perspective, which is obviously their number one goal. But
Yeah.
what about your reputation as a business? Like right now, look at this whole MGM thing that went down, right? I mean, they got slaughtered, and it had nothing to do with them. It was a third party outsourced customer service company that did the wrong thing. Okta's name
Yeah.
is smeared everywhere. They had nothing to do with it either. But now it's MGM's brand. Well,
Well,
I don't want to say maybe not nothing to do with it, but MGM's brand is now severely tarnished with regards to what people are going to think when they go to book a place in Vegas or play the slots. People don't know what happened. They're like, I don't know. Is my money going to get stolen if I play MGM slot machines? They just don't know what's happening.
yeah.
But
Yeah.
because they're like, oh,
Yeah.
well, we outsourced it, so it's not our fault. So we didn't. It's like, oh man, I don't know if that's the right choice.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah. I think these are the natural consequences of the cloud shared responsibility model, right? And it's
Yeah.
like, okay, well, I'm going to take on some risk for this, and we're going to agree to share some certain amount of risk, and the cloud vendors will write down what their boundary of the shared model is, right? And so then that's something that an enterprise risk and compliance management team can look at and go,
Mhm.
okay, I understand this, and I can, if I'm regulated, I can go back to my auditors and say I understand the risk. I'm not solving it, but I understand it, right? Because those are two different and distinct things. I think and I hate to dig on vendors, right? But I,
But
and
I'm going
I'm
to.
actually in this case, but I'm going to, right? Um, in this case, Okta splashed all over, right? As like,
Yeah,
well, they put these agents and they're syncing and the passwords are going in the clear and we got them and like, ha ha ha, right? And they're,
yeah.
like fully, they're fully, blasting them on social media and whatnot. But it's actually not an Okta problem; it's a Microsoft problem, right? It's
Yeah.
like, Active Directory is, and I speak way back 20 years, more to competing against Active Directory and going out and telling people like, don't do this. This is really bad. And they were like, whatever.
Yeah.
Like, it's Microsoft. I'm not going to lose my job for betting on Microsoft.
Yep.
Well, here we are 25 years later, and people are losing their jobs because they bet on Microsoft to do things. And Microsoft didn't do a good job of
Yep.
building security
I
into
mean,
their software. I mean,
how
they
much
just didn't,
enterprise out
right?
there does SSL termination? And they're like, well, once you're inside, it's fine. So it's okay to have everything clear text. You're like, what are you talking about?
What are you talking about? Yeah. So I'm actually working with a company right now that's thinking about how do you do that, because I think there's multiple layers of this problem, right? And so the TLS doesn't have a control plane right now,
Mhm.
right? And so it's just like you set it up and it works, right? And it's like no, and so this company did a scan of the Fortune 500, and there's millions of endpoints out there on the most protected domains in the world that are still serving SSL, TLS 1 and 1.1.
Yeah.
Right. And you're like, what? Like, and
Chrome doesn't
insecure
even support it
ciphers and
anymore.
like, right. It's like, what are you doing? Right. And then that's on the north south external, right? You go inside the enterprise and it's
Oh,
like, it's not even that. It's bad if it's there, but most likely it's not even there.
yeah,
Right.
it's
People are not,
non-existent. Yeah.
yeah.
Like, no,
I
but
mean,
it's on the
there's
same, it's
not,
all behind the firewall. It's like, oh,
it's fine. Yeah.
because no one gets past that firewall ever.
No one ever gets past the firewall. Yeah. How could that possibly happen?
Yeah.
Stolen credentials, right? And we all know that that's the big risk here, right? Is
Yeah.
stolen
People are
credentials.
the
And
weakest
so
link
I think,
always.
yeah, it's always people that are the weakest link. They get phished, they provide their credentials when they shouldn't, and it's bad, right? The
Yeah.
the things that ensue are really bad. So I think better credentialing, and passwordless, I think, is gonna help a little bit, not a lot. I think,
So,
those things are gonna become vulnerable just like everything else, right?
so with these
So
these risks and everything that we're hearing that's happening now, like where do you see the identity management platform as a whole? Like the provisioning, governance, access, federation, orchestration, all the pieces. Where do
yeah.
you think we're going to be 3, 5 years from now? How do you think this is going to morph in the next kind of half decade?
Yeah, I think you're already seeing it happen a little bit, right? Where 10, 15 years ago, the only people that ran risk-based identity platforms were retail banks. Right, they were the only ones. They wanted to know how many times a user had authenticated to their system,
Yeah,
right? In a period of time. They wanted to know things like impossible velocity. They wanted to understand how to do continuous authentication and more context and contextual authorization and things like that. That those things are going mainstream, right? Every enterprise is thinking about, okay, wow, I really need to do this. Authentication can't be a one and done event,
yeah,
right? I need to know where the person is logging in from, who they are, do they have the right device, are they coming from an IP, have they logged in, we used to do scans for these banks, and like they would have an ID that logged in 50,000 times a month, and like, is that
yeah.
good? We're like, probably not, right? And every enterprise needs to know this stuff now to be better at
Yeah,
what they're doing. So I think you see that, and you see the way that sort of the thinking about the way to evolve security architectures as a whole, is really important. And I think what's good about the identity security space and where it's evolving is it's looking across all the layers of the infrastructure now in a way that it didn't before. It was very app centric in the past, right? Like
mhm,
maybe app and data store centric, but now there's infrastructure, there's the network, there's the apps, there's the data layer, there's the code, and uh, code as infrastructure, and how all of this stuff is getting built and rolled out and deployed. And what I see happening with the identity security space is starting to look more coherently across all of those layers, because there's security infrastructure everywhere there, right? And
Yeah.
so you want to be, plugged into, the data that's coming out of the network, and the data that's coming out of the code scanning, as people are checking stuff into repos. Like you need to know all of this stuff. It all kind of needs to go together. And so I think the identity security, looking across all these layers, helps a lot, because it forms a more complete context as you're doing stuff at the user layer that people don't have today. And so I think in the next 3 to 5 years, people will get really good at doing that, at getting better visibility across all the layers of the infrastructure that they have. And with all that data coming in, just in time, we have all of these really great AI models, right?
Yep.
And you can start doing something like reasonable with the data, right? And understanding what's actually happening across all these layers, and identifying patterns and seeing things, and being able to react to them in real time. I think that's where vendors need to improve. A lot of it is like, hey, I scanned your configuration and I can see when people are making changes to your configuration. Great.
Yeah.
Can you stop things from happening in real time? And I think the vendors and like provisioning, right? Like provisioning vendors should have been real time this whole time, right?
Yeah.
Authorization and SSO and provisioning should have been like combined, yes. Right? Because I don't want to just provision you for something. I want to know, have you ever used it? When was the last time you used it?
Yeah.
How many times are you asking for new permissions? Yeah. And so that stuff, I think, ends up really improving how people deploy this stuff, and maybe move away from that Anna Karenina problem a little bit. You can get a more coherent, architected solution that doesn't make you miserable.
So you touched on continuous auth. I think that's I know it's like a buzzword that's trying to be developed right now, I guess. So I guess it's kind of a two-part question. One, do you know anyone doing continuous auth right now in a beneficial way, where it's literally where it works in the way that we're kind of imagining? And then two, how do you envision continuous auth working in an ideal standpoint, where it doesn't just piss off the end user that they're constantly being prompted somehow?
Yeah. The answer to the first part is no, not really, outside of like inside of platforms, right? We definitely played around with that at Salesforce, and trying to be better at, sort of, as people are coming and asking for this data, how do we make sure that, we can authenticate that request, as it's happening, right? And, it started very simple with authentication levels, and then being able to interpret, what level you have and what you're trying to do. And it sort of morphed into the authorization piece a little bit. Anybody general purpose doing it well? I don't think so. No. Because it's really hard, right?
Yeah,
it's really, really hard.
Because it's like you don't want to prompt everyone every 5 seconds. And then you got the people who are like, oh, we're just going to have a camera looking at them all the time. It's like, well, that's some big brother shit. Oh, and then actually, we're going to have it here. These guys, I don't know if you see this, they're at Identiverse, the token ring guys. So they made a ring that has a biometric on it. So you're supposed to wear this. So once you wear it, now I know. So it's like, okay, I feel that's a little encroaching. It's like, I don't want to have to wear this thing all the time. So I think continuous auth will really take off when someone figures out contextual based continuous auth. And I think AI is really going to be that helps that out. Like, once this person logs in, are they typing the way they always type? Is the browser the same way? Is it over the same connectivity? Like, all those tiny little pieces. And if AI can build those successful models, it can determine those fluctuations, and then say, oh, hey, this is a variance of whatever, this should be looked at. Or maybe we prompt them, or we refresh their token early, or something along those lines.
Or even being able to anticipate, is this something that this user should or can or would normally do, so that you don't have to reprompt them, right? And I think when you look at the, people getting hammered on, push notification attacks and things
Oh,
like that, right?
yeah,
Where eventually people will start recognizing like continual prompts as an attack, right?
yeah,
They'll be like, oh, this is bad, right? I'm going to ignore this. I'm going to shut off my phone, whatever it is, right? Um, didn't take long for them to figure out how to how to make that a more vulnerable thing, right? Like there was a time when we were like push notifications, like a true second channel,
yeah.
yay! And then now it's
Well,
like, oh my god,
we
right?
just had an issue yesterday internally. So one of our employees got a text from our CEO saying, "Hey, I need your help real quick. Can you go buy? I need you to buy a gift card for me and shoot it over, whatever." And it's like, and he so he
Yeah,
immediately called me. He was like, "Hey, why have you seen this? Like, is this legit?" So I couldn't reach him.
yeah,
I was like, "That is absolutely not legit." like he,
absolutely not legit.
no one's
Yeah,
gonna text you saying to buy gift cards for you on their behalf. But like they're obviously scouring
no,
LinkedIn, finding the CEO, finding employees, and just shooting out these text messages and emails to
yeah,
everyone blindly. And
yeah,
I thought it
yeah,
was kind of interesting because it's really comes back to, I'm thinking PGP days with the email. Like, how do you know who sent you that email actually was them? So we have
right,
the public private key. I'm wondering
yeah.
if there's going to be a need for just from that type of a level of verification from the text message to prevent phishing and along those lines for OTP codes. Like, is it the right one?
Yeah, I mean, I don't. I think SMS as a channel for delivering anything is terrible,
Yeah.
right? Like, don't do anything over SMS, right? Like,
What do you think's the best method? So if I want to MFA someone in,
I don't
what
know.
do you think is the best way?
Where's my? Let's see. I've got my. So this is good and bad, right? So I've got this one, and I've got this one, and I'm trying to find one. Oh yeah, here's, and I've got
Oh
this
yeah,
one, and it's like, so I think the physical tokens are,
yeah,
probably the thing that's going to be, the most ironclad for now.
okay,
Um, that's a pain in the butt, right? And they
yeah,
are expensive and it's hard to get to people. But at some point, right, we have to say, you know, if we're going to invest 55 billion in the security market over 4 years, and during that
yeah,
same period, the cost of breach is going to go up 30%, we have to do something different, right?
yeah,
Um, and after a while, it's like, well, you know how to use your phone, right? Like
yep,
using a token with, that, or, plugging something into a USB-C, right? It's like, well,
yeah.
okay, this is the price of doing this stuff securely. Um, some point we just have to get there, right? This is costing us too much, right?
Have you
To
ever
not
played
do.
with Web3 wallets in the sense that
Yeah,
you can use them for authentication, but from the level of it's
yeah,
software token or it could be hardware token, and kind of like lets you
yeah,
determine the level of security you want.
yeah. And I think sharing, like, so then sharing that responsibility between the identity provider who's doing
Hmm.
that, who's performing the authentication, and you as the user saying, this is the level that I want to do, or this is the level of assurance that I want to assert about myself. I
Yeah,
think that has to be a part of this, but that's really hard for non-technical users. I always like try
oh yeah,
and imagine, like, what would I tell my mom?
yeah. I do the same thing. I momify everything. Like if my mom can't
And it's
understand it,
like,
if my
nope,
mom can't
doesn't.
do it, it doesn't cut the
Yeah,
mustard. It doesn't work.
yeah, that's not going to work. So,
Yep.
and so I think we have that conundrum where we have a significant population of non-technical people being asked to use highly technical things,
Yeah,
and that's tough, right? You're asking them to do things that are really hard for them to figure out. And the harder it is for them to figure it out, the worse the risk
yeah,
gets, because they find ways around it, or
yep.
whatnot. So
So obviously
yeah, I
the corporations feedback on that is, oh well, we do training. We have these classes where they go online and they watch this video and they answer the 10 questions. Obviously they know how not to be phished. They know how to handle secure documents now, right?
if we were sufficiently training people to not be fished, then people would stop fishing. It's
Yeah,
obviously a profitable enterprise still at this
yeah.
point, so people keep getting fished. And they're not even that good. Like,
Oh,
if you
that's a
know how
numbers
to
game.
look for and recognize
Yeah,
that stuff, they're not even that good. So it is like reminds me of what was it, the Bank of Quarters and Saturday Night Live. Oh, we'll make it up on volume. We make change. Well, how are you going to make money? We'll make it up on volume. I think that's the way the fishing industry
Yeah,
works, right? It's
absolutely.
just you don't have to get a million. You just need to get
No,
100, right?
we got an email again sent to us, throughout our company of saying, hey, we've got into your computer, we have all of the porn you've been watching, and we got all this stuff on you, and we're going to release it
Yeah,
all if you don't send us $500 to this Bitcoin address. And it's like, okay, delete. But I was curious, so I took the address, went online because it's all public, right? That dude made over
yeah,
$5,000 at that point in time when I looked of people actually paying him the ransom.
yeah,
And it's just like, that's what it is. It's like, and that's
yeah,
just that one address. How many addresses was he using and rotating? Like, it's just sending out
yeah,
millions of emails blindly, and they're making
yeah,
bank off of this.
yeah, yeah. Because everybody's email is compromised. There isn't a
Yeah,
single email out
yeah.
there that's not
Email's
compromised.
never secured.
It's
Like, that's what's interesting. We really don't have a really good secure communication platform. I don't feel like that rivals
yeah,
how email works necessarily.
yeah. Yeah, and if you've been involved in any of the credit agency or the credit reporting agency breaches, which I have, they like to send you, we found your email on the dark web. I'm like, yeah, because of
Yeah,
you, and
yeah,
duh,
exactly.
right?
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for the heads up, right? Um,
Well, that's where I think
yeah, so
decentralized identity will help, is the fact that like those breaches where like someone gets in and we've stolen 6 million usernames, passwords, emails, and their SSNs, like, and now we're going to dump it on the dark web for sale. All that goes away. Now it's individual attacks, so they can attack one person at a time versus millions at a time. I think, to
millions at
me,
a
that's a
time, yeah.
huge thing that we really need to start moving towards, because it's just getting worse and worse. Because we're getting, I mean, I'm just going to, this isn't the right thing to say, but we're getting dumber people in charge of these systems that just don't care, or they don't understand what's actually happening anymore because they're not as technical, because we've made it, the software has become so, it's not easy, but it's not like what it was before. It was so massively complicated, only like the super smart people could figure it out. Now you can have dum-dums that are in charge of it, and they have the keys, and those dum-dums are getting themselves jacked, and those keys then were compromised.
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't even say they're dumber, right? I think it's just become so incredibly complex that I think even smart people have a hard time figuring it out sometimes, right? But definitely the people that aren't as smart are like really going to struggle with it. But
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I spend a lot of time in my consulting business telling people to build less software. Like, build less. You don't need that. Don't do that. Like, don't build that until you know that this other thing actually works. So because there's a lot of really bad software out there, and when you have bad software and you try and fit it into an architecture, it makes things more complicated really quick.
So that's kind of similar to something I coined this term recently, just out of, I was talking with someone, calling it security bloat, where they kept piling on all these security mechanisms because they really wanted to ensure that there was no risk in every vulnerability they found. So they had to make sure this software did this and this one did that. And eventually it was so massively complicated that the lag was just insane. Like, it was your 6-second login times, and there's just too many checks and balances in place, too many false positives were kicking up all the time, and it just made it impossible to do day-to-day activity. So that's why I was like, you guys got security bloat, you have way too much stuff in place, you need to trim down and kind of
Yeah.
refine and be more efficient across this as well. Are you seeing something
Yeah.
like that happening now? Because before, no one gave a shit about security, and now I feel it's like we've kind of pendulum too far, where everyone's panicking and going too far sometimes.
Yeah. Imagine how many dashboards an average infosec team is looking at every day, right?
Yeah,
And trying to like parse out signal from that. Like, how the hell would you even know?
yeah, yep.
Really, really tough. So yeah, I think people are, I think they're struggling with that, and they'll continue to struggle with that. And that's why I like to see, kind of what we were talking about before with, these things that are starting to span these layers and collect and aggregate that data and present it in a kind of a more coherent way. That's going to
Mhm.
help these infosec teams and these CISOs that are looking at this information to be able to take action on it, right? And to get it closer to real time, and to get the lags, taken out of it. And um, as vendors commit to that stuff, I think it'll get better for those CISO teams, but in the infosec teams. But every vendor's like, hey, I've got AI ML models that are going to show you stuff in a dashboard. Like,
Yeah.
oh my God.
So with your new venture, What Why Consulting, are you kind of tackling those types of problems? What are you doing now? What's the new sexy stuff that you're working on?
Yeah. Yeah. So my thing is really about helping people to build better products. And to do that, I think, you need a coherent vision, you need a strategy, you need a roadmap that supports that. And then you need the team that can execute that. And I think that's so I think as I think about helping companies, it's starting there. And then it's also, once you start building out the team, you realize that a product team or a product management function is great, but what you need is a product organization. You need people that are involved across the value life cycle of the product. And that's not people that were traditionally in product development, engineering, product management. They're in customer success, they're in pre-sales engineering, they're doing implementations, they're spread across an organization. And so I'm trying to help people think about how they build that product organization so that more people are involved earlier in it, right? Imagine how many times you would have loved to know what was getting built before it got delivered to you.
Oh,
right?
yeah, absolutely.
Right.
So for
So
companies, let's say
yeah.
that are startups where they don't have a whole dev team and they can't really have that much overhead, what would you say would be like kind of like the top 3 things they should focus on in building their software for the enterprise market?
I think number one thing is know why you're doing it, right? And to be able to you internalize and understand how it's going to change the life of your customer, right? Saying I'm going to build a dashboard is a how, right? It's like
Yeah.
how I'm going to present you the data. It doesn't say how I'm going to change the life of that infosec person that needs to look at that data. And so I think that's the number one thing. The number two thing is don't build as much. Everything is so complicated and we use so little of the software that's actually out there.
Sure.
And so I think that's a big part of it as well. And then I think the third thing is being, very good at watching and analyzing usage and having good metrics and understanding how people are using your software so you know how to improve it so that it's doing a better job as you've deployed it out for users.
Cool.
Because I think a lot of that was missing for a long time.
No, that makes sense. All right, cool. So first one, know the why. Second one is do what you're trying to accomplish. Don't stray out and try to solve the whole world. And
Yep.
then third one is really, just focus on the metrics coming back from your clients and refine it to get that deliverable product.
You know what, Adam? I totally agree with what you're saying, and I think that's spot on.
I'm just going to use that clip forever for everything that I use
Dude,
now.
yes, absolutely. Absolutely do.
Cool, man. Well, hey, I really appreciate you
All right.
coming on. This has been awesome. Is there anything you want to like shout out, or is there anything you want to like tell anybody before we take off?
No, I just thank you for having me. I think, this kind of collaboration and discussion is going to be really beneficial for people. And, thanks for doing what you're doing.
Awesome, man. Who do you think I should talk to next? Not to put you on the spot.
So you know what? Simon Moffat at the Cyber Hut. Reach
Okay,
out to Simon.
I will
I
reach out
think
to
he
him.
might be interesting. Yeah, or Ian Glazier is another one.
Okay,
Yeah.
awesome, man. Well, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Cool. Yeah,
Cool.
awesome. Thanks. All right, I'll talk to you soon.
Anytime, man. Have a good one.